Hello and welcome to the Below the Surface podcast. I'm your host, Gunnar. My usual partner in crime and co-host, James Hammond, just couldn't make it this time, so we have to make do without him. Today I'm talking to an old acquaintance and friend of mine, Andrew Kohlrusch. He's a head honcho at GHD. He's also an EPA Auditor. And he has this incredible amount of experience and knowledge that I regularly try to tap into. We talk about how the usual process of preliminary site assessment, detailed site assessment, remedial action plan, as it's set out in the various legislative instruments that we have, how that process of PSI, DSI, RAP, in many cases, in particular for larger sites, needs to be slightly altered. The results of a DSI, of the detailed site investigation, quite often get taken as the input data into what we call remedial action plans or RAPs. And Andrew discusses with me how that is not necessarily a good way to go about it. And we discuss how that process can be improved. I hope you enjoyed. I certainly did. And here is Andrew. Man, between you and James, it's easier to get an appointment with, I don't know, whoever the Prime Minister is at the moment.
I don't mean that way, Gunnar, but the last probably 4 or 5 weeks has been pretty stretched in terms of...
Is it mostly auditor work that you're doing that keeps you so busy?
No, defence work. So I have not seconded, but I have 2 days a week I'm supposed to devote to defence for their PFAS group.
Yeah.
And I don't even get close to spending the time those two days a week. So I'm often getting hassled to review this and review that, and they're in the middle of a contract on one of them, and the contract is being a bit bolshy in terms of asking for variations when they shouldn't probably be asking for variations.
So let me just get this straight. You are working on behalf of defence and supervising other consultants.
Yes, I'm there to give advice in relation to any curly questions or anything that's changed. It's not that complex, the projects, but just navigating defence and its systems. There's also access constraints on some of the sites. One of them, which is really weird, has a railway corridor going through it.
Oh, good one.
So they need to get approval to actually remediate the site from New South Wales government.
Did you find any arsenic by any chance on the rail corridor?
Well, we don't know because we're not focused on that. That's another part of the defence has to worry about that. So
here's a hint: you will.
Without a doubt, yes. There's a few challenging projects, just in terms of trying to marry site assessment work with mine closure. That's always a big challenge because mine closures, they're dealing with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of cubic metres of material that's being moved around. So a little bit of TRH or whatever is probably really not that relevant.
If you wait long enough, it's going to go away.
Oh, well, of course it will. That's right. There's more than enough bugs around there that are going to do their jobs. And what about yourself? What have you been up to?
No defense jobs, unfortunately, but the usual stuff. My big sites are probably the ones where you wish you didn't have to do them because it's not worth your time. So
no, it's not that well. Yeah.
We work in different leagues.
You sail a different size boat than I'm sailing. Yeah.
Yes,
but they still have to get to the destination. So,
I remember. So first of all, you are a member of quite an elusive club. I don't even, but you do know.
Yeah.
But you are an honorary member of the club of people that I bug when I get stuck. So like, man, I have no idea how to tackle this one. Well, let me give Andy a call. And I have a couple of people that I try to spread the love.
Yeah.
But you are an honorary lifetime member of that club.
The Gunnar support club.
That's right. That's exactly right. See, the trick is, or the thing is, when you work for GHD like you do, right? If you get stuck somewhere, you either walk down the corridor, and there is someone who knows this stuff, who has nothing, nothing else to do but deal with that particular problem, right? Or even if you can't walk down the corridor, you pick up the phone and call someone in, I don't know, Zimbabwe in your subsidiary there, and I don't have that, so I need.
No, having that support network is very handy.
Yes,
but if you're an auditor, someone like, for example, he would have to have other people outside his small company.
Yeah.
That would be giving him health risk assessment advice, or maybe landfill management advice.
It's funny you mentioned he's also a member of that club.
Well, you're certainly in good hands with. He's a very clever fellow.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I haven't seen him for a while.
He's on holidays right now because I tried to get a hold of him, and I get an auto reply. It's like, I'm on holidays.
Oh, right.
No, he's very good.
Yeah, no, I do like him.
But you are the only auditor who I have ever heard who wrote a letter to council that do not bother me with this kind of site.
Well, I think, look, if auditors want to keep work, that's great. But I think sometimes the audit systems
is being abused. There's no question. There's no question about it.
Absolutely. If you're digging a basement, if you're digging 2 or 3 meter, 2 or 3 story basement, there's no need you need an auditor. I did an audit for a project in the CBD. They're going down five stories.
Yeah.
Basement.
On a high riser in the CBD, you're all right. Have a $30,000-$40,000 audit, big deal, right? That's not a major drama. But for someone who wants to build a swimming pool in Cornell, that's a drama. In one of my attempts to get a hold of you as a honorary club member, I get a text back from you saying, "Hey, can this wait? Because I'm about to watch Billy Joel."
Yes,
in Maddison Square Garden, right?
Yep.
And I'm innocent me, right? I'm like, hey, Billy Joel in Maddison Square Garden. It sounds like a good one. That must be some streaming service, or So I send you what service? What is it on Netflix or what is it on, right? So all I get back is a photo of you sitting.
Oh, that's right.
In Maddison Square Garden, looking at the stage. Yep. So I thought, okay, in that case, I'll let you go. My question can wait.
Yeah, no, that was quite good actually. That whole trip. So
I bet you it was. So I asked James the other day if you can pick anyone, dead or alive, any person, to go out to dinner with, right? Who would you pick? This is one of those famous questions. So Andy, I shoot that question to you. Anyone, dead or alive, who would you pick?
Well, apart from Prue.
Prue, your wife. See, this. See, James, I'm glad James is not here, but that's exactly what I said when he asked me. It's like, hey, I would take Louise, right? And but he immediately jumped to Richard Dawkins or wherever it was. But congratulations, Andy. That's the way to answer this question. So who would you take? You two would take Prue with you to see whom?
I think David Bowie.
Get out of here, really?
Yeah. I loved his music. He seemed to be a really interesting character. The fact that he went through various incarnations through his music and everything.
Yeah, he had a few characters that he played.
Yeah, that's right. Ziggy Stardust, and then he went to his Let's Dance 80s phase and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I think the fact that he in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he went through very different genres, yet he just pretty much did his own thing.
I hear he was also an incredibly astute businessman, which is rare when you are an artist genius. These two don't gel usually, business and artist. So he was both.
Yeah, he was very, very different. He just wasn't. He just didn't seem to be afraid of being himself.
Yeah, didn't he also live in? At least have a house in Byron Bay or up there somewhere?
Probably, like most of them did. Yeah. That would be. And the other one would be Clint Eastwood. Again, someone who started off doing his Dirty Harry stuff, etc., and then becoming a director of renown in not just in cowboy movies.
You're right. Whenever you hear an interview with him, he really sounds like someone who you could have an interesting conversation with.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so.
I picked Sam Harris. I don't know if you know him. He's a philosopher, neuroscientist.
Right.
Love his work, love his books, love his podcast. But after that, I actually thought of, what do you think of Louis Theroux?
Oh, yes. You know what? I would like to be with him when he goes to some of these mad, wacky places and interviewing people.
Yeah.
I'd love to just to see how he truly interacts with it. Look, it seems to be very faithful when they show that he goes in there, and sometimes there's some trepidation asking some neo-Nazis about questions about whether they really do like hate black people or whatever, or goes to, you know, the polyamorous people or whatever. He's a real interesting character. Some of the
Westboro Baptist Church was a fantastic one. By the way, if you hop on, I think it's Netflix. Is he streaming on Netflix? I don't know. But in one of the streaming services, he has released a new episode where he goes back in his career, because he stayed in touch with a lot of the people he interviewed. And he goes through that and says, okay, I have stayed in touch with this person and with this person, and where are they now? And and it's a really, really interesting episode that he's put together. It's actually a series. Highly recommended.
Yeah, I'll just put a note here, because he doesn't seem to pass judgment in his questions.
Oh.
Like, he might be asking questions of someone who he might be abhor what they think, but it never comes across in his questioning. He's always truly interested in how people think and why they are living the life they are. So he's very bold. I don't think many interviewers are like that.
He is a master interviewer, and he's also mastered the awkward pause like no one else.
Yes. He's probably had plenty of opportunities to.
So maybe we should start talking contamination after all. So I sent you, I've been trying to get you on here for a long time. So I said, because I didn't really know what, other than Billy Joel and stuff, we could talk about. So I said, hey, what's close to your heart? Pick a subject. Yeah. And you said, I wrote it down. You said, site assessments are not remediation assessments, but RAPs are often based on just the data from a site investigation. Better outcomes could be released if additional data was collected to characterize what really needs to be remediated. And I thought that's brilliant. So let's talk about that. So we need to go back to, not everybody who listens to us is a site contamination specialist. Mm-hmm. Tell me, when we do a site assessment, so there's stages that we have set out in. It was SIP. See, there's the first acronym, State Environmental Planning Policy number 55. Since it's a public service that had to be renamed, it's now called Resilience and Hazard until further notice. So in there, our site assessment or our contamination site assessment process is outlined. Give us a quick rundown how that is supposed to work.
How it works, you need to understand what the site used to be used for, to see what you're going to test for later in your sampling. To do that, you need to do almost an historical assessment of the site. So you collect various pieces of available information. That might be information that's freely available on the web these days, or you might want to actually talk to people who have knowledge of the site, who used to either work on the site, the types of, activities they used to do on the site, and that helps build an understanding of where there might be sources of contamination.
So that's a preliminary phase. It's called a preliminary site assessment, a PSI. In theory, at least, that is supposed to inform whether you need to do anything else.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Because if there's nothing that has happened there, why would you do anything else? In theory, you should be able to stop there. In practice, that hardly ever happens.
Yes.
The PSIs, or the preliminary assessment, should inform the sampling of the next stage, the detailed site investigation, the DSI. And then in theory, once the detailed site investigation is done, the next step in the environmental planning policy is the remediation action plan, the RAP. So if there is something that needs to be remediated, we need to write a remediation action plan in which we outline, guess what? A plan to remediate it all.
That's right.
And you think there's a step missing, is that right?
I definitely think there's a step missing. So the EPA has sampling design guidelines, which give you an indication of how you should plan a sampling project. It'll have, as I said before, about the site history and everything that tells you where you might have contamination, and the sampling design guidelines say, right, if you think there could be contamination, these are some guidelines to help you design a sampling plan. And there are various types of sampling plans based on the size of the site, the activities, etc. So they give you a number that you can say, righto, this number is endorsed by the EPA. And we'll make it really easy, is that generally for a 1 hectare site, 21 sample locations on an equally spaced grid is a starting point anyway of doing a characterisation of the site. That just characterises statistically, and you know a lot about statistics, Stuart, that just characterises sites statistically about whether you have contamination or not. It doesn't say whether you, and that's only to a certain degree of probability. If you do your 21 samples locations across the site and you find that there's nothing in any of the soil samples you've collected or the groundwater samples you've collected that are above an investigation level, that is, if you come back with your samples having statistically less than those particular threshold numbers, you can say your site is suitable for that particular land use. But that's still based on statistical confidence of 95% generally. So there's a 5% chance there could be contamination.
95% sounds like that's de facto for sure. Yeah, 1 in 20, you missed. We have to keep that in mind, that if you have your upper confidence level of that we need to calculate, and it's 95%, 1 in 20 sites, you're getting it wrong.
That's right. So if, for example, and I won't delve into statistics because that's really not my bread and butter, but if you had your 21 samples across your 1 hectare site, and then everything said everything's fine with the 95% confidence level, so you could say that 5% of your site could be contaminated, but you haven't found it. But it's not relevant because statistics says it's okay. But 5% of a 1 hectare site is 500 square metres. And that's a fairly large piece of land that you haven't actually characterised. And the other thing too is that 21 samples per hectare, as a rough guide, is roughly 1 sample every 500 square metres. You know, that's a big lot of land. If you went and did your characterisation of your 1 hectare site and you said everything's okay and it's split up into 20 nice blocks of 500 square metres, one of those blocks might be contaminated. But which one of those blocks? So is that a risk that people are willing to take? If you do find some contamination on the site, well, then you need to actually understand, right, if I have contamination on the site, how much do I know about the contamination? Is it just at this one particular spot? Is it much broader? Does it go into areas that I didn't sample? Because I'm only taking 1 sample every 500 square metres. There's a lot of space between a sample point that is contaminated and your next sampling points which may not be contaminated. And that's the biggest issue that I have with the sampling design guidelines are just about to characterise the site, whether yes or no, whether it's contaminated. There's no guidelines about, well, how much more sampling do you need to do to then characterise what your volume of contaminated soil is? And that's where the big dollars come in.
Yeah, well, so for starters, Mark Salmon, the author of the sampling design guide, I have him on my list, and he's even harder to get a hold of than you are. He would have some other things to say about that, because look, it's going to be a different podcast, but the sampling design guidelines, the latest ones that we have, so it started off with 1995 and then nothing happened until 2022. They have been, I would say, brutally ignored. What has been taken out is that the minimum number of samples per hectare and per site, that has changed, but the rest, which is the solid statistical analysis that you should be undertaking, has just been ignored. But I'll talk to Mark about that. It also goes into the area of where, when you say we take one sample every 500 square meters, I had a long discussion with Ross McFarland, and that's has already been released as a podcast about how representative is a 200 milliliter jar of an area of 500 square meters when we have contaminants that are known and proven to be super heterogeneous.
Yes.
Different discussion yet again, but let's not go there. Well, so then what happens if you have a couple of samples that hopefully are next to each other, and they exceed at least your tier 1, your guideline level, let's call it that. If they exceed your guideline level, your next step most of the time it shouldn't be, because you should be looking at the risk profile, but that also gets ignored generally, and we immediately jump to remediation.
Yes.
Based on, and this is where you come in, based on the number of samples and a sampling grid that was never designed to inform an RAP, a remediation action plan. It was designed as a site assessment, as a initial screening, I would argue.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, and that's right, because most RAPs that I see as an auditor, if you do have contamination that's been found on there, it's amazing how many areas that are contaminated are in these very neat squares. It's incredible how uniform the contamination is. These little nice neat squares. It's amazing, or rectangles. It always seems no one ever draws circles around them, or polygons or anything like that. And that's often just based. And the thing is that you could give that same lot of data to 10 different consultants, and you come up with 10 different scenarios. And that doesn't help our clients in terms of getting confidence in the consulting industry. As they know, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You're always saying different things. A contaminated site, say if it's fill, for example, it's contaminated fill that was brought on from many, many years ago. It's almost like an ore body, except this time you're paying for removing the ore out of the ground rather than actually extracting it. And the mining industry has very strict guidelines about how you define the volume of an ore body, which goes from a resource through to a proven reserve. And you have to do all this extra sampling. And that's where this much cleverer statistics are brought in to actually give you confidence that you are actually have identified your reserve, just like you try to find how much contaminated soil is there. Because despite what some of our clients might think, the biggest amount of money that's spent in the whole assessment, remediation, validation exercise is the remediation contractors, not the consultants. Giving the consultants a bit more time to collect the samples, get them a bit more money to collect more samples than less to actually properly characterise your volume of soil means you have greater confidence in saying, righto, contractor, we're pretty comfortable that we've delineated how much contaminated soil is there. We can get a firm price from you. It reduces variations, especially if someone has to go out and get a loan to pay for the remedial works. Once it starts going over that loan amount, then you're in all sorts of strife. So, and then they down tools, and you get the delay cost. So there's a whole host of hidden costs that the clients don't see at the time of doing the investigation works. And I just feel that maybe more consultants could have more of a discussion with their client about, right, we've found some contamination. We really like to get a better handle on how much there is before you just go out and put an RAP with these square locations, which are never going to end up being these square locations. And also not just an RAP, but you need to have specifications about what needs to be done. One thing that also is not often undertaken in, say, for soil remediation sites, there's always an assumption that there's a volume of soil, whereas a volume of soil is not what the client gets charged. The client gets charged for excavating a volume, but in terms of what goes off-site, if it's going to a landfill,
tonnage,
they're getting charged a tonnage. In my view, you should have an understanding of what the density of your contaminated soil is as well. So rather than just estimating a density of 1.5 tonnes per cubic metre, actually measure it. And also, square holes aren't dug just square because you need to take into account that, once you go to a certain depth, you have issues with slope stability and safety and all that sort of stuff. So the amount of work you need to do to extract your soil might be a lot more material that needs to be removed than just the actual soil that's contaminated.
Look, I completely agree. So that if we write RAPs, remediation action plans, based on the grid pattern that we have put on during the detailed site investigation, because we are trying to be conservative, which is one of those things that I hate when people
yes.
are conservative. It's like, no, you're supposed to be representative. You're not supposed to be conservative. You need to do a representative sampling, not conservative. Don't get me going on that. Mm-hmm. So they go to the nearest clean spot they have instead of going halfway and sampling there. That would have been a good idea, wouldn't it? Or along those lines.
Oh, without a doubt, yes. So the clean samples are great. That gives you your upper bound, I guess, of the contamination that needs to be removed. But there could be 20 to 30 meters going from your dirty spot to your clean spot. So
yeah, and you're assuming on top of it, that your clean sample actually is clean, and it wasn't just a luck of the draw because you 10 grams of sample that you took didn't find any of.
Yeah, well, it's right. 5 meters away from it, it's dirty. So I've always thought that the biggest cost of the whole site assessment management process is the remediation contractors. And so it's like building a house. You don't just go and tell someone else, just start building a house there. Just start building it. You'll say, I need to understand the ground conditions, all those sort of things before you actually start building.
Are you telling me that this happens? Because again, the 1-2 hectare sites is more where I'm playing. And in there, even sometimes on the smaller ones, you can say, all right, I have enough information with a couple of samples there, because ultimately the soil volumes, whether it's even the density, if it's 1.6 or 1.8, it doesn't matter in this particular instance because the volumes are so small.
Yes, yeah.
So for the medium kind of sites, I can understand why people, and I have done it, why we say, look, I have enough information from the DSI, let's go. But are you telling me this is also happening on some seriously bigger sites, like at airports and at defense sites? Is this commonplace?
Oh, well, I'm certainly, and this is my personal view, this is not GHD's point of view. I have to just preface that. But yeah, certainly in the work that I've done, but certainly I've seen on clients like defense, it's the same thing, but people like myself and some other much cleverer people who are remediation advisors to defence on some of their big sites are asking for a lot more characterisation of areas before they start doing the remediation. They want to make sure that when they're signing off on the public money being spent in relation to remediation, that they have a pretty good understanding that it's that measure twice, cut once scenario. Sometimes it's just the nature of the beast. We have some clients that time is money. They've bought a block of land or they've bought an area, and they're paying interest on the loan, etc. They need to get it ready to build on more quickly than they can. So
that is one of the problems I've almost every time have, is that there is time pressures. Hey, we need to get that DA in. They ask for an RAP. Can you just write me a remedial action plan now? And I'm like, I don't have enough data. Just write it. Let's get it in. So then you write it, and what you're saying is just ultimately not right, but you get it in there to make sure that the DA gets going, and then nothing happens for a year and a half, and suddenly the client calls you up and says, hey, we got approval. Let's implement this RAP. And I'm going, the RAP we wrote super, super quickly with very, very little data. Is that the one you want me to implement? Yeah, let's go. We're starting. And
as a consequence, there's probably material that's going to landfill. It doesn't need to go to landfill.
Oh my God, yes.
Especially in relation to unengineered fill that's found on sites, which has might have ACM in there, might have other chemicals in there, etc.
ACM, asbestos-containing material.
Yeah, that's right. That's your biggest uncertainty. A leak from an underground storage tank, it's pretty easy to follow that, unless it goes really deep and underneath under buildings and lots of stuff. That's a different matter. But largely, the biggest uncertainty is where you have lots of fill on site, and trying to characterize that just based on a very simple grid approach can be fraught with danger. And I said, it can waste money. If it was my money being spent, I'd say, look, if you're going to spend an extra 10 or 15 grand to do a lot more sampling, and that could save me 100 grand or 200 grand on disposal costs, by all means do so.
Look, when you have a very good relationship with a client who trusts you, who you have worked with, it's a different story. Yeah. Very often you work with a client for the first time, and you have quoted for your assessments, and they are already super suspicious about you asking for more, because I said, look, I've done my assessment here. Yes. In an ideal case, you should let me go out again, and it will save you money in the long term. They don't hear that. What they hear is there is a consultant who's trying to screw me for variations. That's what they hear.
I'm sure they do. Yeah.
And I can understand that, because our industry, not necessarily the contaminated sites industry as well, but the industry where you deal with a lot of civil contractors, there's bound to be someone in there who has quoted very low, counting on variations. It's a done thing in lots of industries.
Yeah, look, that's right. And I think, and I'm not saying anything bad about contractors, I think they just generally have a mistrust of almost everyone who they subcontract. That can be consultants, that can be like plumbers, the tilers, all that sort of stuff, or whatever, the concrete guys. It's just the way they probably operate on really small margins. They're saying, right, well, I have this margin, and if it starts getting eaten into, I'm going to get less. I can't really sell the properties as an example, for a developer. I can't sell them for any more than what I've already quoted. So every variation is actually going to take money out of my pocket. And that's just unfortunately the nature of the beast. A colleague of mine, actually, you know him, Peter Beck.
Yes.
He gave a good presentation a number of years ago. And so he actually was able to show quite clearly that where the client was willing to spend a bit more money with the consultant and the auditor in making sure the planning for the remediation was done better, they had generally better outcomes in terms of the costs. They took more samples in locations. They were also trying to prove where contamination wasn't, rather than just where contamination is. And as you know, probably most remediation projects probably go 50, 60% over the original budget. And maybe that's because there's just not enough planning involved in there, or not enough time to collect the right samples.
It sounds so easy, but it isn't, because first of all, for me to even get to the DSI, the detailed site investigation phase, that is a competitive tender where I have to clearly cut costs to get the job. As a result of that, I will not sample more than I absolutely have. See sampling design guidelines, right? So then we end up with a detailed site investigation that is based on the absolute minimum.
Yeah.
Very often then you're already embedded in that project, and then you write your RAP, the remediation action plan. But it is difficult to talk to your client and say, hey, what I have done in the detailed site investigation ain't enough. It works with the clients I regularly work with, where I try to educate them that the detailed site investigation is not a single event. It is a phase.
It is. And perhaps the guidelines could have been a bit clearer, that one lot of sampling as part of a DSI might give you all the answers.
Might.
But it might not. And that's where the data quality objectives, which are part of your sampling plan and which leads into your detailed site investigation report, that's where that fluidity should be outlined, saying, right, this is what our aim is. Our aim is to identify whether there's contamination, and that's largely how you build your report on based on the data you collect. You then talk about whether you're able to define the contamination to appropriate statistical confidence. But if you don't, well, that at least gives you the opportunity to say to the client, look, we have a few things we're a bit uncertain about. And I think that's perhaps explaining it to them. We're consultants. We should be not just saying this is the guideline A, B, and C. We should be able to actually explore a bit more, saying, well, based on what we've found, we think that if we do this extra sampling, this could be the benefit.
How often have you heard it, though, that you go to your client and say, hey, look, this is really what we should be doing here? And then the answer that you get back is, when is this going to stop?
Well, it is. Yeah. You do need to find a client who actually trusts you. You know, and that's the biggest challenge. Now, you know, sometimes we're just thought as being a burden on our client. And I've had one client years ago said, "You're just an unnecessary cost to our development." I said, "Thanks very much."
No, but you can understand where it comes. I can so see it where it comes from, right? Look. Let's ask you this. So you want a carport at your house, and you ask a couple of guys, and then they come back with X $1,000, right? The moment this guy comes back, and while he's working on it, tells you, you know what we should really be doing is this, and it's going to cost you $5,000 more. Your first thought is not, I'm so glad this guy is doing this now, because he's trying to do it right. Your first thought is, this guy is trying to rip me off. Let's face it.
Mm-hmm.
That is how a lot of my clients, or the clients who don't know you, who you haven't worked with, I can understand that this is their reaction.
Yeah, well, that's a very fair point. And unfortunately, we're dealing with the unknowns. We're dealing with a large area, maybe, even a 500 square metre lot is still a large area where we don't, as you said before, 200 milligrams per sample. 200 grams per sample is how much?
200 grams, out of which then 5 get used.
Correct. So we're trying to make judgments on the condition of 400 square metres or 500 square metres based on 5 or 6 grams of soil. And there's a lot of uncertainty in doing that. And so, in fact, you know, we should be paid a lot more because we take a big risk on making judgments on really small amount of data, and that makes it very challenging.
I had a long discussion with Ross McFarland about this. I'm strong of the opinion that the way how we sample is inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not right.
No.
The mining industry's got this figured out.
Yes.
They don't make multi-million-dollar decisions on 5 grams of samples. No. We for some reason do, but that was a different podcast.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me and talking to me about this.
It's been my pleasure, Gunnar.
Ultimately, guys, dear consultants who are listening, try and promote the idea that a detailed site investigation is a phase that needs 1, 2, 3, 4 steps sometimes before you have enough information to write your remedial action plan. We all know how hard it is, but let's face it, that is the right way to go about it. It's a detailed site investigation is a phase and not an event.
Absolutely. It's not the end spot and you just jump straight into the remedial action plan. It should be a bit more thought taken about it. As I said, I like the adage, measure twice, cut once.
That's a good one. I like that. Who came up with that? I've heard it before. That's not
someone much cleverer than I did. I don't know. Probably a tailor, maybe.
Hey, you say hi to Prue, and thank you so much for your time. It's much appreciated.
No problem at all. We'll catch up soon, mate.
See ya.
Bye-bye.